Let it break by break.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Luqman, and this is Brick by Brick. Thanks for joining me on a Thursday night at 8 o'clock instead of 9. I appreciate that you've come over and decided to join me on a different day. A little tired, a little worn out, but I couldn't skip another day in talking about this very, very important part 3 of this series on neoliberalism with you. This could not wait for the rest of the week. So here at Brick by Brick, we believe that it is incumbent on all progressives, all progressive activists to understand the enemy, neoliberalism. That's the enemy. That's why this particular episode is incredibly important. Because this ideology, embraced by both political parties, touches on every single progressive issue and should be a point of unity among all disparate groups within the progressive movement. Because without knowing who and what we're fighting, we're punching in the dark with one hand tied behind our backs, at the same time creating unnecessary divisions amongst ourselves. We all know that the enemy is the 1% and corporate interests, that they've perverted our democracy, undermined our government, but without knowing what unifies the 1%, why they do it, what motivates them. Outside of just greed, we're left in a state of confusion and frustration, and that is actually by design. That's why it is so important that we go over this particular history in the progression of neoliberal economic policies tonight. So last week we left off in 1950 when Friedrich von Hayek joined Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, and we gave a brief introduction to this group called the Chicago Boys. Sounds like a Broadway troupe, right? Well, tonight I'm going to explain who they were, what they did, and why they are so incredibly important to economic history, to our current political history, and to the progressive movement in America today. So let me talk about Friedman's dream. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to crib a lot of notes from this amazing book that I am reading right now called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. If you have not read The Shock Doctrine, you need to read it to understand in much more in-depth and greater and more intellectual detail than I could ever give you on what neoliberalism is and what it's done, not just to the American economy, because it's been implemented here on a small scale, but what it's done around the globe. So according to Naomi Klein, Friedman dreamed of depatterning societies. You know, when you set up a pattern in a society. Friedman wanted to break the pattern down of returning societies to a state of pure capitalism, a clean slate economically, cleansed of all interruptions. And interruptions were government regulations, trade barriers, and entrenched interests. Sound familiar? Friedman believed that when the economy is highly distorted with these interruptions, the only way to reach that unspoiled state was to deliberately inflict painful shocks or bitter medicine. He believed that these painful shocks could clear the patterns out of the way, and his tool of choice was policy. The shock treatment approach he urged on bold politicians for countries in distress. This is what the Chicago Boys implemented in countries around the world. But before we can discuss the Chicago Boys, we actually need to discuss their target, Latin America, or more specifically, the Southern Cone countries of Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Now, as you can see, this is a map of the Southern Cone countries. I hope you notice, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Falkland Islands also appear on this map. That tiny little speck right there, the Falkland Islands. This is worth noting. Keep this in mind, the Falkland Islands. It doesn't have anything to do with our history tonight, but it has an incredibly significant portion in the history that we'll discuss going forward. It's also interesting to note that the intersection of a very revered folk hero in this point in the history of South America. Because in 1952, a young medical student at the age of 23 left his home in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and traveled with a friend through South America, through the length of Chile and beyond on a motorbike. He kept a journal documenting the injustices he witnessed along the way, primarily of mine workers that were exploited by American corporations in South America. There was a political shift happening, and our traveler was a witness to it. He documented it. What he was documenting was the rejection of corporatism. And it became a major part of the resistance against corporatism in South America. Now, our Motorcycle Traveler's journal wasn't published as a book until 1995 under the title The Motorcycle Diaries. And the author was Ernesto Che Guevara. What he was documenting was the uprising in South America that led to the implementation of developmentalism in South America. What is developmentalism, Jacqueline? Well, in South America, and particularly in the Southern Cone countries, developmentalism was an economic response to American corporate domination of the natural resource mining industries. South America, incredibly rich in natural resources, and you know how imperialists are. Wherever we see resources to be exploited, we will go there and exploit them and the people in order to make a buck off them. Well, the people of South America were tired of that. Developmentalism actually was an extension of FDR's New Deal. That's how popular, that's how effective the New Deal was. It was being implemented in other countries. But it actually went further. Developmentalism went further in pursuing a more protectionist position for countries, with an emphasis on economic policies that addressed inequality and poverty and repelled foreign intervention. By the 1950s, the developmentalists, like the Keynesians and social democrats in rich countries, were able to boast a series of impressive success stories. Developmentalism was working. The most advanced laboratory of developmentalism was the southern tip of Latin America, known as the Southern Cone. Just showed you Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Parts of Brazil also. The epicenter was the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, based in Santiago, Chile, and was headed by the economist Paul Prebisch from 1950 to 1963. Prebisch trained teams of economists in developmentalist countries and sent them out to act as policy advisors for governments across the South American continent. Nationalist politicians like Argentina's Juan Perón put their ideas into practice with a vengeance, pouring public money into infrastructure projects such as highways and steel plants. And in doing so, giving local businesses generous subsidies to build their new factories, churning out cars and washing machines, keeping out foreign imports, and putting their people to work at decent wages. And one of the ways they kept foreign imports out was to implement forbiddingly high tariffs on them. As a result of these developmentalist policies, the gap between the region's 1%, their version of the 1%, the elite, and their peasant masses began to narrow. Income inequality in South America began to get better. It was being reduced. By the 1950s, Argentina had the largest middle class on the continent. And next door, Uruguay had a literacy rate of 95% and offered free health care for all citizens. And can you imagine that today our government officials tell us that these countries are backward, underdeveloped? Well, they weren't always. Now, I want you to think about something. The current mantra of America First is supposed to be an inwardly focusing political policy and even economic posture, seeking to build up the internal economic foundation to benefit Americans, very much like developmentalism. However, as we're now seeing this mantra, this campaign slogan unfold, we see that it's a sham, and it always was. But the Southern Cone countries meant it, and they were implementing it. That didn't go unnoticed by the United States. Not happy that they were being squeezed out of the profits that Southern Cone countries were making, in response to this threat to U.S. corporate interests, the State Department collaborated with the Ford Foundation. I know you're familiar with the Ford Foundation. The State Department collaborated with the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, I know you've heard of them before, and Harry Truman's Point 4 program to sponsor students from Chile to study economics at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, the father of neoliberal economic policies. The University of Chicago's Department of Economics set up scholarship programs with Chile's Catholic University. Between 1957 and 1970, about 100 select students received premier neoliberal economic training from Milton Friedman himself, first in an apprenticeship program in Chile, then in postgraduate work in Chicago. Once they completed the program, these Chilean students, these Chicago boys, were then dispatched back to the Southern Cone countries, where they achieved positions throughout those countries' governments. And all of this was done to influence and direct the economic policies in these countries, to turn them around to allow for the greater economic exploitation of the United States and to reduce the benefit to the people of these countries. The training program they were involved in was called the Chile Project. Now, Naomi Klein says that there are few economic environments as heavily mythologized as the University of Chicago's economics department in the 1950s, a place intensely conscious of itself, not just as a school, but as a school of thought. It was not just training students, it was building and strengthening the Chicago School of Economics, the brainchild of a coterie of conservative academics whose ideas represented a revolutionary bulwark against the dominant statist thinking of the day. To step through the doors of the social science building under the sign reading "Science is Measurement," and into the legendary lunchroom where students test their intellectual mettle by daring to challenge their titanic professors, was to seek nothing so prosaic as a degree. It was to enlist in battle. As Gary Becker, the conservative economist and Nobel Prize winner, put it, we were warriors in combat with most of the rest of the profession. Like all fundamentalist faiths, Chicago School Economics is, for the true believers, a closed loop. The starting premise is that the free market is a perfect scientific system, one in which individuals, acting on their own self-interested desires, create the maximum benefits for all. Remember we talked about Adam Smith's invisible hand in the last episode? Well, Adam Smith never envisioned the invisible hand to be one of selfish pursuit. What Adam Smith was talking about was the invisible hand of what he believed was man's innate morality. But invisible hand under Friedman's tutelage and through the ideology of the Chicago School of Economics began to mean nothing but selfishness. And to this day, that is the misinterpretation of Adam Smith's invisible hand theory. Now we're getting to the brick. And I must note right here that Brick by Brick is in no way related to the brick in this reference. I did not name this channel after this horrendous economic policy. It actually was called The Brick, or El Ladrillo. The project that the Chicago boys were embarked upon was actually unsuccessful until around the 1970s. And the brick, this economic policy that they developed, came about during the election of 1970. They called it the brick, but it was formally called the Program for Economic Development. It was a 189-page document that Chicago boys in Chile had been trying to implement for years without success until 1970. So what happened in the election in 1970? Let's backtrack a little bit. Jorge Alessandri was president of Chile from 1958 to 1964. He was selected by the Chilean Congress because none of the three candidates who ran in the 1958 election secured an overall majority of the popular vote. Who were the other two candidates? These other two candidates are why the election from 1958 are important. Because the other two candidates were Eduardo Frei Montalva and Salvador Allende. They'll play significant roles in the future of Chile. But back to Alessandri right now. He led a coalition of conservatives, liberals, and radical party congressmen. And at first, he focused on controlling inflation and liberalizing Chile's tariffs. But he forced a freezing of public sector pay, which of course made him unpopular. So in the Chilean midterms, conservatives and liberals suffered massive losses as a result of people being unhappy with their pay being frozen, which forced Alessandri to appoint and nominate more ministers from the Radical Party because the conservatives and the liberals had all lost, most of them. And the Radical Party was the only party Chileans still trusted. This began the move in Chile of the government farther to the left. This did not sit well with Friedman's devotees in Chile or in the United States. And although the Chicago boys remained on the fringes of political influence and thinking for a couple of decades, the BRIC was presented during Jorge Alessandri's unsuccessful run for president in 1969. Alessandri rejected the BRIC. But that didn't stop the United States from working to make sure it was implemented all the same. Again, remember, Alessandri was president from 58 to 64. He was selected by Congress to the presidency after a three-way tie. So according to Chile's constitution, he couldn't succeed himself. So he didn't run in 1964. But Montalva and Allende did. Montalva won in the 64 elections by a large margin over Allende. Why is that important? Because Montalva was the leader of the Christian Democratic Party of Chile, who the CIA in the U.S. thought was important enough that they should finance his campaign against Allende. The CIA spent a total of, it is reported in declassified documents from the CIA, this is not a conspiracy, this is actually documented in CIA documents, CIA records, that they spent a total of $2.6 million to run a campaign against Allende to ensure that Montalva won. Why would they do that? Because Allende led the People's National Front party. And the People's National Front was a coalition of socialist and communist parties whose goal was to impose imperialist, oligarchic, and feudal policies in their country. I encourage you to study more on the background of these pivotal elections and the role of our government in them. I cannot go into them in much detail tonight. I wish I could, but it's fascinating. Just know that Russia ain't got nothing on us in regard to interfering in other countries' elections. So, after Montalva's term, he served one term. Salvador Allende, the socialist candidate that the United States didn't want to win, actually won the next election by a slim majority in 1970. The majority was so slim between the three candidates that once again, the Chilean government, the Chilean Congress, had to decide who the winner was. And they decided it was Salvador Allende. So, here is a face to go with the name. This is Salvador Allende. What's so special about Allende? Upon taking office, he implemented a number of significant reforms, like improving public works programs, nationalization of key industries, like copper mining and banking. He allowed the government to administer the healthcare system. He had the government administer education reform. He constructed massive public housing. Notably, Allende implemented a free school milk program to address childhood malnutrition. That had also been done in Great Britain in 1946 following the end of the Second World War. And the free milk program in Great Britain plays into the history we'll talk about and the connection with this history in another episode. Don't forget that. Free milk. Allende's programs started to show immediate economic improvement. Inflation fell by a third in 1971 over the previous year, while wages rose on average by 22%. Minimum increases for blue-collar workers rose by 56%. Allende also intended to improve the socio-economic welfare of Chile's poorest citizens. A key element was to provide guaranteed employment either in the new nationalized enterprises or on public works projects. It's ringing a bell. But over here in the United States, the possibility of Allende winning Chile's election was deemed a disaster. That's why the CIA spent $2.6 million to try to make sure he didn't win. Because they wanted to protect the United States' geopolitical interests by what they claimed on paper at the time was preventing the spread of communism during the Cold War. But no, it was all about money. Because Nixon was reported to have said about Chile at the time that Allende took power and began to implement these reforms that began working the very next year, Nixon was reported to have said, "Make the economy scream." The economy of Chile. What does that mean? What did Nixon mean? Well, here's what was done. All loans to Chile were ended, and the economy did scream, which caused an uprising against Allende. Allende was set up by the United States government, just like Puerto Rico and Greece and other countries have been, but it wasn't the IMF that blew Chile's economy, that made it scream. It was President Nixon. And it was the State Department under Henry Kissinger. In September of 1970, President Nixon informed the CIA that he did not accept, he refused to accept an Allende government in Chile, and he authorized $10 million to stop him from assuming power or to unseat him. Henry Kissinger's 40 Committee and the CIA planned to impede Allende's assuming office of president with covert efforts known as Track 1 and Track 2. This is all documented CIA and State Department history. None of it is conspiracy. All of it is true. What were Track 1 and Track 2? Track 1 sought to prevent Allende from assuming power via so-called parliamentary trickery. Remember, the Chilean Congress appointed Allende to president after a three-way tie. So the United States government planned to interfere with the parliamentary rules of the Chilean government. And then, under the Track 2 initiative, the CIA planned to convince key Chilean military officers to carry out a coup. Track 2, however, was aborted because initiatives were already underway within the Chilean military to do just that. On June 29th in 1973, Colonel Roberto Super surrounded the presidential palace La Moneda with his tank regiment, but he failed to depose the Allende government. That was the first attempt at a coup. It was unsuccessful. On August 9th, in 73, President Allende appointed General Pratas as Minister of Defense. He got rid of Super, appointed General Carlos Prats. Sorry, I mispronounced his name again. On August 24th, 1973, General Prats was forced to resign both as defense minister and as the commander-in-chief of the army. Why? Because he was embarrassed by what is known as the Alejandrina Cox Incident. and a public protest in front of his house by the wives of his generals. What was the Alejandrina Cox Incident? So apparently, General Carlos Prats was known to be kind of a level-headed guy. So this incident shocked many people. He was in his official car, and he stops at a stop sign. His driver stops at a stop sign. Another car pulls up beside him, and there are people in the car who recognize him, and they're making gestures and they're making fun of him because not everyone is supportive of Allende. Colonel Prats gets angry, and he takes out his gun and he starts waving his gun at this car full of people that's next to him, stopped at the light. He is thinking that the driver of this car is a man. It shouldn't make any difference because he shouldn't be waving a gun around at unarmed civilians who are just stopped at a light, who just happen not to like the president for whatever reason. It incensed Prats. He's telling them, get out of the car, or move away. They don't. The driver, General Prats, in a rage, shoots the tire of the car. He gets out of his car, the driver gets out of their car, and that is when we realize that the driver of the civilian car is not a man, but of a woman, Alejandrina Cox. And the fact that General Prats shot at not only the car of unarmed civilians, but at the car of an unarmed housewife, literally sank his career. Because less than 2 weeks later, he had to resign as defense minister and as commander-in-chief of the army. Now, as funny and as ridiculous a story as that is, why is it important to any of this? Because the resignation of General Carlos Prats paved the way for the appointment of General Augusto Pinochet to replace him as Army Commander-in-Chief. And this is where the history of Chile turns brutal and bloody. After a period of political unrest, Allende had announced that he would propose a national referendum to put an end to the turmoil in a speech to be delivered on September 11th, 1973. Before he was able to deliver that speech, however, the military, under General Pinochet and aided by the United States government, made their move on Allende in the second, and this time successful, military coup in Chile. On the morning of September 11, 1973, tanks rolled down the boulevards of Santiago and surrounded the Palacio de la Moneda, the presidential palace, as fighter jets flew overhead, firing on the palace. Pinochet and his supporters referred to the events of the Chilean 9/11 not as a coup d'etat, but as a war. Chileans had, until this point, experienced 160 years of democratic rule. But the events of the Chilean 9/11 gave Chile a taste of what we know today as shock and awe. With just 36 Allende staff and supporters inside the palace, 24 rockets were fired into the building. Allende took to the airwaves to address his beleaguered and terrified nation one last time. He said, "Workers of my country, I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Other men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. Keep in mind that much sooner than later, the great avenues will again be opened through which will pass free men to construct a better society. Long live Chile! Long live the people! Long live the workers! Allende was offered safe passage to leave Chile but refused, determined to fight for his country and his people. Shortly after his last radio address to the nation, the coup plotters announced that Allende had committed suicide after 24 rockets were fired into the presidential palace. This has, of course, been challenged over the years, but some court somewhere in December 2011 ruled Allende's death officially as a suicide. You decide. So now let's talk about Pinochet. Pinochet had full control of all the military might that were engaged in the coup. A coup that many scholars and experts have confirmed, don't just believe anymore, have confirmed would never have been successful without the involvement of the United States. People like Peter Wynne have written that the role of the CIA was crucial to the consolidation of power after the coup. The CIA helped fabricate a conspiracy against the Allende government, which Pinochet was then portrayed as preventing. He stated that the coup itself was possible only through a 3-year covert operation mounted by the United States. Track 1. He also points out that the U.S. imposed an invisible blockade that was designed to disrupt the economy under Allende. Remember, Nixon said, "Make the economy scream." And that invisible blockade contributed to the destabilization of the Allende regime. That's why people were becoming upset with Allende. That's why he was becoming unpopular. Author Peter Kornbluh argues in his book, The Pinochet File, that the U.S. was extensively involved and actively fomented the coup in 1973. Authors Tim Weiner in his book, Legacy of Ashes, and Christopher Hitchens in his book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, similarly argue that the U.S. covert actions actively destabilized Allende's government and set the stage for the coup in 1973. More from Naomi Klein. She says the generals knew that their hold on power depended on the Chilean people being truly terrified. In the days that followed the coup, roughly 13,500 civilians were arrested, loaded into trucks, and imprisoned, according to a declassified CIA report. Thousands ended up in the two main football stadiums in Santiago, the Chile Stadium and the huge Nacional Stadium. Inside the Nacional Stadium, death replaced football as the public spectacle. Soldiers prowled the bleachers with hooded collaborators who pointed out subversives. The ones who were selected were hauled off to locker rooms and skyboxes transformed into makeshift torture chambers. Hundreds were executed. Lifeless bodies started showing up on the side of major highways or floating in murky canals. Pinochet sent his most ruthless commander, General Sergio Ariano Stark, on a helicopter mission to the northern provinces to visit a string of prisons where subversives were being held. Subversives were mostly people who were left-leaning, supporters of Allende, supportive of developmentalism, supportive of socialism, communism. At each city and town, Stark and his roving death squad singled out the highest profile prisoners, as many as 26 at a time, and they were subsequently executed. The trail of blood left behind over those 4 days, came to be known as the Caravan of Death. Some interesting things to note Pinochet's economic policies, he followed the BRIC, included the privatization of public schools. We have as the head of the Department of Education right now a staunch advocate of privatization of public schools. We had before her appointed by a Democrat, one was appointed by an alleged Republican, both adhering to neoliberal policies of privatizing public services. Pinochet also introduced school vouchers. It's believed that this is the first time in the history of the industrialized world that school vouchers were ever introduced. All bad ideas come from somewhere, don't they? Does that send a chill down your spine? It should. Also, milk again. Pinochet repealed the free milk program that Allende had implemented. Why is this important? All right, I'm going to give you a little preview. A few years later, as education minister in the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher also repealed the school milk program that had been in effect in the UK since 1946. And because of that, Margaret Thatcher has been forever branded by progressives in the UK as Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher. This epithet actually followed her to her grave. A month after the coup, Chile was supposed to host a qualifying soccer match for the 1974 World Cup against Russia, against the USSR, as it was called then. The USSR declined to play in the stadium where atrocities had been committed so recently. The USSR, the evil empire, refused to send its soccer team to play in a stadium where innocent Chileans were tortured and slaughtered. FIFA, the World Cup governing body, allowed Chile to play the match without their opponents. What they did was the Chilean soccer team went to the stadium, kicked the ball into an open goal, and that qualified them to go on to the finals. Why would FIFA do such a thing? Could it be they didn't want to lose the revenue they would have made? Oh, that's just another part of the neoliberal net that I don't have time to get into tonight. But I do want to talk about Orlando Letelier. Orlando Letelier was a loyal supporter of Allende, and he had been appointed to the Chilean ambassadorship to the United States. And he had recently returned to Chile to assume the post of defense minister. But on the morning of the coup of September 11th, he was seized by 12 soldiers as he entered his office building. As many VIP prisoners were, he was transported to an isolated island prison camp. He was severely tortured, as were thousands of others over the next year, 12 months. He was moved around to various prison camps until finally, bowing to international pressure, Letelier was released on condition that he leave Chile and live in exile. And let me give you a face to put with the name. This is Orlando Letelier. Letelier was told by the officer in charge of his release that the arm of DINA, which was the Chilean secret police, is long. General Pinochet will not and does not tolerate activities against his government. This was a clear warning to Letelier that living outside of Chile wouldn't guarantee his safety. So Letelier moved back to Washington, D.C. And I actually remember this incident. If you lived anywhere on the eastern seaboard or in the Maryland, D.C., or Virginia area, I'm sure you remember it too. Letelier became a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He remained a vocal opponent of Pinochet and his regime. He wrote against it. He gave speeches and lobbied Congress and European governments against Pinochet. But on the morning of September 21st, 1976, driving to work with two passengers, Ronnie Moffett and her husband of 4 months, Michael, as they rounded Sheridan Circle in Embassy Row at 9:35 a.m., a bomb exploded under their car. Michael survived, but Letelier and Ronnie Moffett both died gruesome and painful deaths. Letelier had half his torso blown away, and Ronnie Moffett died from drowning in her own blood from a severed larynx. And to this day, there is a memorial in Sheridan Circle, right here in Washington, D.C., to Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett. In the days after the incident, spokespersons for the United States Department of State, the people responsible for all of this terror, issued a statement saying that they express their gravest concerns about Dr. Orlando Letelier's death. Due to the assassination of Prats and the attempted assassination of Bernardo Leighton, you'll have to look him up, the incident, the murder of Letelier and Moffett, was believed to have been the latest of a series of state-sponsored assassination attempts against Chilean political exiles. A spokesman for the FBI said that this was the first incidence of violence against Chilean exiles on American soil. They have that documented in their records. Now, I talked about the horror, the terror, the chaos, the brutality of the Chilean September 11. Now let me talk to you about how the Chicago boys saw September 11th in Chile. September 11th was a day of giddy anticipation for them because they had been working on trying to implement the BRIC, the Milton Friedman-based economic policy that was designed to free the free market to do what they believed would be the most good for everyone. They really didn't believe that, but that's how they packaged it. So on the day of the coup, several Chicago boys were camped out at a printing press at the right-wing newspaper called El Mercurio in Chile. And as shots were being fired in the streets outside, they were printing copies of the BRIC. They were working nonstop as Chilean citizens were being slaughtered to duplicate copies of this economic plan to get them into the hands of the members of the new government. And they did. Before midday on Wednesday, September 12th, 1973, the general officers of the armed forces who performed government duties, who had just staged a military coup, had the BRIC on their desks. The proposals and the final document mirrored the ideologies of Milton Friedman's ideas from Capitalism and Freedom. What are they? Privatization, deregulation, cuts to social spending, the free market trinity. and it was about to be implemented on an entire country for the first time in economic and political history. In the coming years, the same policy laid out in the BRIC would be implemented in dozens of countries. No, implemented is not the right word. Imposed. Because these countries, the people in these countries didn't want them. And these policies would be imposed in dozens of other countries under cover of a wide range of crises. If it wasn't a military crisis, it was a political crisis. If it wasn't a political crisis, it was a natural disaster that created chaos, fear, terror, and the initial shock, and then the adherents of the BRIC or our neoliberal economic vultures would come in and propose a solution to the shock that was just as shocking as the initial chaos itself. But it was Chile that was the counter-revolution's genesis, a genesis of terror. For the first year and a half of his reign, Pinochet faithfully followed the Chicago rule. He privatized some, but not all, state-owned companies, including several banks. He allowed cutting-edge new forms of speculative finance. Think subprime lending. He flung open the borders to foreign imports, tearing down barriers that had long protected Chilean manufacturers. Think of NAFTA. Think of CAFTA. He cut government spending by 10%, except for the military, which received a significant increase. Think not of just Trump's recent budget proposal, but think of the budgets under the last 3, 4 modern presidents. He also eliminated price controls. It was a radical move in a country that had been regulating the costs of necessities such as bread and cooking oil for decades. The Chicago boys had confidently assured Pinochet that if he suddenly withdrew government involvement from these areas all at once, the natural law of economics would rediscover their equilibrium, and inflation, which they viewed as a kind of economic fever, indicating the presence of unhealthy organisms in the market, would magically go down. This goes back again to the invisible hand theory, but in the way that Friedman devotees think of it, not in the way that Adam Smith saw and explained it. And of course, the Chicago boys were mistaken, because in 1974, inflation in Chile reached 375%, the highest rate in the world, and almost twice the top level under Allende. The cost of basic stuff like bread went through the roof. At the same time, Chileans were being thrown out of work because Pinochet's experiment with free trade was flooding the country with cheap imports. Local businesses were closing, unable to compete. Unemployment hit record levels, and hunger became rampant. The Chicago school's first laboratory was a debacle. So now the agenda of Friedman and the Chicago boys was in danger. So what happens? Milton Friedman and a cohort fly to Santiago to meet with Pinochet, the man who had just arrested, rounded up, tortured, disappeared, murdered over 30,000 innocent Chileans. Throughout his stay, Friedman hammered a single theme. The junta, the military police, were off to a good start. 13,000 people. Actually, it ended up being 30,000 by the end of his regime. But what was needed was for the fuller embrace of the free market. Friedman told Pinochet that he called for a shock treatment. It was the only medicine. Even when a Chilean reporter pointed out that even Richard Nixon imposed controls to temper the free market, Friedman snapped, "Well, I don't approve of them. I believe we should not apply them. I am against economic intervention by the government in my own country as well as in Chile." Friedman made some personal notes about his encounter, which you will find in his memoirs. And he observed that the general was sympathetically attracted to the idea of shock treatment, but was clearly distressed at the possible temporary unemployment that would be caused. That's very odd for a man who had just ordered and orchestrated the torture and murder of over 13,000 Chileans. Let me fast forward a little bit. So by 1975, Pinochet got to work stripping away the welfare state to arrive at their pure capitalist utopia, because Friedman had told Pinochet that in order to achieve the economic realities that he believed the BRIC would deliver, he had to make deeper cuts to public services. So in 1975, Pinochet cut public spending by 27% in one blow, and they kept cutting until by 1980 it was half of what it had been under Allende. Health and education took the heaviest hits. I hope this is sounding familiar to you right now. And I honestly hope you are not just terrified. I honestly hope you are mad as hell. Even The Economist, a free market cheerleader, called what was happening in Chile an orgy of self-mutilation. In all of this, the systematic human rights violations that were committed by the military government of Chile under Pinochet included gruesome acts of physical and sexual torture and abuse, as well as psychological abuse. From September 73 to March 11, 1990, Chilean armed forces, the police, and all those aligned with the military junta were involved in institutionalizing fear and terror in Chile. One of those common types of imposing fear was disappearing people. See, this is done not to just inflict pain and fear and torture upon the person who's taken. This is done to instill fear in the people who are left behind. The disappeared were held in secret. They were tortured, they were murdered. The National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture, otherwise known as the Valak Report, and the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation, otherwise known as the Reddick Report, approximate that there were around 30,000 victims of human rights in Chile, with 27,255 tortured and 2,279 executed. Disappearing people was a way to ensure that the survivors, those who remained, those who weren't physically tortured or sexually abused, remained uninvolved in affairs of the government. The psychological terror of knowing that you'll be disappeared if you speak out against what's being done was intended to keep people silent in the face of their oppression, even as their liberties, their ability to provide for themselves and their families, and their very security were all being taken away by the government. Ask yourself, honestly, do Black Lives Matter protesters look a little different to you now? Do you understand a little better now? I hope you do. With the human rights investigations that followed, there was a focus on the atrocities, though, but not the underlying cause. So many of these human rights groups were depending on funding and restricted to the mandate of their sponsors. Who were their sponsors? The most significant source of funding for this work was the Ford Foundation, the largest philanthropic organization in the world. They were involved in the implementation of this terror from the beginning. Their involvement in investigating the humanitarian work was nothing more than damage control. As Naomi Klein puts it, what happened in Latin America was treated as a murder scene, when in fact it was the site of an extraordinarily violent armed robbery. General Augusto Pinochet was indicted for human rights violations committed in his native Chile by Spanish magistrate Baltasar Garzón on October 10, 1998. He was arrested in London 6 days later and held for a year and a half before finally being released by the British government in March of 2000. Authorized to freely return to Chile, Pinochet was there first indicted by Judge Juan Guzman Tapia and charged with a number of crimes before dying on December 10, 2006, without having been convicted in any case. His arrest in London made the front page of newspapers worldwide, as not only did it involve the head of the military dictatorship that ruled Chile between 1973 and 1990, but it was the first time that several European judges applied the principle of universal jurisdiction, declaring themselves competent to judge crimes committed by former heads of state, despite local amnesty laws. All of this horrible history of brutality, torture, disappearing people, sexual abuse, shock treatment, shock and awe, it is all relevant to what is going on in this country today. I understand that we may not be seeing people disappeared in the numbers as high as tens of thousands by the United States government. At least we don't think we are. We don't think of it that way. But imagine all of the people who have been accused of misdemeanor crimes, who cannot pay their bail, and they are sitting in jails for months, sometimes years, awaiting trial, having never been convicted of a crime, but the state is making money off of their imprisonment. We may not think of our government as physically torturing American citizens, but you cannot tell me that what you just heard about what was done in the Nacional soccer stadium in Chile doesn't sound exactly like what was done at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. The human rights abuses that Pinochet committed were abuses that were fully and completely known by the United States government. And not only did we know what he was doing, we supported it. We allowed it. We wrote the blueprint for it. We made money off of it. And if you think this history of the full implementation of neoliberal policies in a little country like Chile can't happen here, you are not paying attention. While Pinochet was under house arrest in London, one notable person publicly supported him, to the surprise of the majority of the British public. to the surprise and the disgust. However, as we'll be learning in our next episode, this unconditional support isn't really that surprising. Join me next week. I believe I will be airing on Wednesday night, our regular night, at our regular time at 9 p.m. for part 4 of our series on neoliberalism, the next generation, when Ronnie met Maggie. Thank you for joining me.
The chance of Senator Pinochet receiving anything resembling what we in Britain would recognize as justice in a Spanish court is minimal, not least because key witnesses for his defense run the risk of immediate arrest if they set foot on Spanish soil. What is planned there is a show trial with a preordained outcome, lingering death in a foreign land. I don't know when or how this tragedy will end, but we will fight on for as long as it takes to see Senator Pinochet return safely to his own country. Chileans can rest assured that however contemptibly this Labour government behaves, the British people still believe in loyalty to their friends. Where would you like us to sit? We'll sit here, please. Thank you.